Hello, everyone. Good morning to you. You are live on VOA Africa's Facebook page. From wherever you're joining us, I am Ignatius Annor live from Washington. And this morning, as we told you yesterday, there are very important conversations we're trying to have here at the Voice of America, coming off of the assassination attempt on the life of former US President Donald Trump and its implications on the November 5th elections. We just want to hear from analysts on the latest development and, of course, discuss the impact of what happened, matters arising, and the political tension that is within the country. Now, you will recall that on Saturday, July the 13th, a 20-year-old man nearly killed former President Donald Trump at a rally in the U.S. state of Pennsylvania while he was addressing his supporters. Now, we understand that federal authorities are working to unravel the unanswered questions about the shooter and his motive. Currently, the breaking news is that the Homeland Security is investigating the Secret Service agent. Now, we also know that President Joe Biden condemned that attack and denounced political violence following the assault on his main rival, Donald Trump. So I'm joined right now by two guests. Michaela Millender is a research fellow at the Soufan Center that is based in New York, and Declan Galvin is the managing editor of Exigent Risk Advisory, which is a consultancy firm, a strategic consultancy firm based in Nairobi, in Kenya. So, lady and gentlemen, thank you for taking the time to join us this morning.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
I keep saying this morning, Declan, without realizing that it's evening your time in Nairobi.
It is, yes.
Okay, so I'm going to start off with you first, Millender. First of all, help us understand what may have led to the unfortunate event that occurred in Butler, Pennsylvania on Saturday.
Yeah, so I think that it's important to state, although we don't know the ideological motivation of the shooter, and law enforcement are continuing to investigate what that may be. This event on Saturday didn't happen in a vacuum, but rather in the context of a larger milieu of violent political rhetoric, heightened political rhetoric, calls for civil war or holy war, and rampant misinformation, disinformation, and conspiracy theories, which we've even seen in the aftermath of the event that began to spread almost instantaneously after it happened. So this confluence of factors, I think, is sort of what has led analysts to believe that we were in an environment, unfortunately, that was quite ripe for something like this to happen. I don't think many were surprised, sadly, that something like this did happen. And now we run the risk of, heightened violence as a result, not only of this event, but also because of the broader environment that we've seen in the United States more broadly.
Michaela, thank you for that. Declan, I'm going to come to you. Whether any precursors, for example, that pointed to what could have happened. But I would first ask you how you received the news. You are a US citizen yourself, have been in East Africa for a decade now. Were you surprised? What was your reaction when you first got the news?
I was not surprised for the same remarks that my colleague just made. The political environment is so charged in the United States, and everyday people feel like they have a lot to lose, depending on the scenario that plays out in November, and those are just normal kind of everyday American citizens. Of course, there are fringe extremists on both sides who really want to kind of push a more extremist agenda, and that can lead to, and often will, if allowed to continue, the events that we saw on Saturday. So it's not a surprise.
Michaela, just shortly after the incident occurred, we heard from President Joe Biden actually addressing the nation and indeed the world from the Oval Office. And the takeaway from that was a condemnation of what could have happened, and also saying that, quote unquote, America is not a place for a political violence, unquote. What would you make of his reaction as the number one citizen of the country?
I think it's an attempt to bring the temperature down. I think that's what seems to be Biden's tactic here. Is trying to discourage these kinds of actions, even if you oppose someone politically. That can be done in obviously nonviolent ways, but also bring the temperature down. I think in terms of the rhetoric that's been circulating around the election, that seems to be a priority of the president and some other politicians. Although then you're also seeing other politicians who seem to be determined to ramp up the rhetoric. But that definitely seems to be the priority of the president, recognizing sort of the wider environment that the event happened within.
Declan, is that enough, you think?
Look, so yes and no. Ultimately, the country is just divided, and I know we say this so often, and we hear that so often, that we kind of we glaze over at this point. But the United States is so polarized. What more could he do? He could probably do things, but ultimately, his detractors and so many people who are involved in and pushing information on social media are just convinced that he's, evil and that he's totalitarian and he's all these, to do what he needs to as president.
All right. Let me circle back to a response or reaction that we received from Nancy Pelosi, who was Speaker of Congress at the time before Mike Johnson's, or even McCarthy, Stephen McCarthy took over from her, and she actually went back to comparing the response of former President Donald Trump to an attack that was made on her husband when somebody attacked him in his home and hit his skull, and essentially saying that she did say that as somebody who had experienced that, from a family that has experienced that, they wish that God's, peace and blessings and healing for him. When you compare the two, because President Donald Trump at the time had mocked the attack on Nancy Pelosi's husband. What do you make of Nancy Pelosi's reaction vis-a-vis the fact that Trump is on the other end this time? I'll go with you, Declan, first. Yeah.
So look, I mean, ultimately, our politicians in the United States, they are rarely acting like the adults or the mature individuals that we need, right? So it's the parallel between the attack on Trump and the attack on Nancy Pelosi's husband. These are the same. This is from the same vein, right? One was more of a physical assault with a hammer, I think is what it was. The other is a shooting. Of course, these are also, while they're both attacks, a shooting is far more violent. There was, I don't think we could claim that there was anything other than an attempt to kill the former president. These are all connected, right? Even if one is a bit more extreme than the other, and I think that's what's key.
Michaela, your take?
Yeah, I would agree. I think that what these two incidents represent is an increased threat against politicians in the United States, against political figures, against law enforcement. This is a trend we've seen for quite some time. There's been, threats, although they didn't come to fruition, threats against President Biden that have been deemed legitimate, by federal law enforcement, as well as, other threats such as kidnapping governors and others. And so I think that it's part of a larger trend that we've seen where, again, what we're getting at is this increased, threat of political violence in the United States, unfortunately, that's been occurring for, some time.
So, what are we likely to see as the campaign is heating up with just a few months to the elections? What are we likely to see, and what is likely to be the implications or the impact of this on the November 5th elections? We've heard from strategists within the country that it sort of would drive up sympathetic vote towards Trump. That has not been confirmed, but that's what is being thrown out there. What are we likely to see to be the impact of that incident on the elections coming up? I'll begin with you, Michaela.
Yeah, it's hard to know, whether or not this can be played in a sympathetic way. It certainly could be. I think as for me as a security analyst, what I see being some of the implications of this is unfortunately an increased risk of reciprocal radicalization. So even though we don't know what the ideological motivations of the shooter are, that hasn't prevented what we've seen online, whether that be calls for vengeance or revenge on behalf of the former president, increased militia activity, which was already ramping up before this event occurred. But this is another data point to ramp that up further. And so, unfortunately, I think what the implications are is seeing a potential increase in violence in lead up to the election, and using this as sort of a justification for that. And that potentially that threat increasing the closer we get to November. And then, in the aftermath, depending on, especially in light of, what happened on January 6th in 2021, is what may happen in the aftermath of the election, depending on the outcome. That threat also increases, I think.
Declan, what's your take?
Look, so very, very similar. I think that I'm concerned about reprisal attacks. I'm concerned about anticipatory attacks. From lone wolves and people acting as individuals, militia type organizations is what was just mentioned. I mean, these are within the realm of possibility. And unfortunately, it feels like our political environment now, the tapestry, if you will, includes these characters in these organizations as genuine actors, and that should be a concern for everybody. That we have a stricter association of violence and politics in the United States. Historically, just as a bit of a tangent, historically this is not new, right? Political assassinations often characterize national change in the United States. We can see what transpired in the 1960s. We could see what transpired in the late 1800s and early 1900s, where we had societal shifts. I think we're in the same moment right now. So it is there are historic parallels. I think that from a purely kind of political calculus, Trump is going to consolidate his support based off of this. The photo of him with a raised fist, in front of the American flag is iconic. Trump is very good at the imagery associated with campaigns. He's going to use this, and if we think post-election, what's going to happen after the presidential election? Let's say a scenario where Biden wins. There's going to be significant pushback. We saw what happened in the Capitol. There's so much going on, and none of it's good.
And would you even describe it as uncharted territory? And I'm asking this because you are in a country, Kenya, in East Africa, that looks up to the United States as a beacon of hope for its democracy and the way the country runs its affairs. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, we saw President William Ruto had a red carpet treatment here in Washington. What are locals saying, and what are they gleaning off of a country that they look up to?
I think, anecdotally, and you can see it in some surveys, I think that kind of this notion of U.S. exceptionalism as a leader of democracy, I think that's diminishing. It's true from an institution's perspective, from the kinds of programs that the State Department and aid agencies will roll out. It's true that a lot of democracy promotion is part of this, but it is also abundantly clear that American democracy is in crisis. And we have, when you have diplomats who are preaching democratic practices and improvement in a place like Kenya, they say, look, your former president was almost gunned down. You had an attack on your capital, right? The U.S. does not maintain the moral authority that it used to, and I think it's just becoming clearer, and that's upsetting. But as they say, it's in the rebound, right? So if we can rebound out of this and show that we've got resiliency, that Americans can come together in crisis, maybe there's an upside there, but I'm pretty pessimistic right now.
Right. Michaela, what image is this portraying to the outside world? Like I said early on, a continent like Africa, there is Asia, the Indo-Pacific that see the United States, there's Europe, for example, that see the US, as this shining light. Declan has just explained his thought of saying that that image seems to be diminishing, unfortunately. What image is it portraying to the outside world, and is it even possible to salvage that image?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with my colleague here on this. In the aftermath of January 6th in Brazil, you saw something not too dissimilar from what happened in this country in their own. And I think that whether we like it or not, the way that our democracy functions in this country does seem to export to other places in terms of acceptability. But we're also seeing political violence in this country, and we're also seeing, and it seems to be on the rise in other places as well. We had the attempt against the Prime Minister of Slovakia that happened quite recently. Mexico has also seen rampant violence against political figures and people running for office. And so, I think that in terms of our image in the world, it's not good in these other places that have had various experiences with democracy, to see a place that has tried to position itself in an image way as a beacon of democracy, seeing that diminish, I think is, I would imagine, quite demoralizing for the rest of the world. And you do see, I think, even in Europe, people building their own type of resiliency and trying to prepare for what may happen in November. As a result, we've seen this with NATO. We've seen this with other alliances. I think people trying to anticipate what may happen if the U.S.'s image as a beacon of democracy, as a leader in the world, is going to diminish. What then do other countries need to respond to that with? So I think you are seeing sort of these political calculations around the world beyond the image of us being a democracy. How will that then also impact alliances and other things going forward?
And is it possible to, what would it take to salvage that? One of the arms of governments that I even studied in senior high school is the judiciary. So you look at, for instance, the Supreme Court in the United States, for example. Recently, there was a ruling that precludes former President Trump from any repercussions on actions that were officially taken into office. And we've heard from analysts across the aisle who have also spoken up against that ruling, for example. So the question is the judiciary still going to be that arm that can safeguard the democracy that the both of you believe is diminishing, based off of the happenings in recent times, particularly during election periods?
I think that you do see chatter, and I know that President Biden, I think, just quite recently said that he would like to propose, or that there's talk of him proposing potential reforms, for entities like the Supreme Court, which is certainly a conversation, I think, among many people in the United States about ethics concerns, about term limits, things like that. But I do think that we saw a mix of rulings come out of the Supreme Court that that show that it's not always quite one way or the other, whether it's upholding democracy or not upholding democracy. So I think that I think that it will be interesting to see how the conversation evolves in terms of is something like reforming the Supreme Court realistic? Will that something like that be able to be pushed forward? And I think that that conversation will continue to evolve, as the election moves forward and who ends up being in office in November.
All right, we're almost wrapping up our conversation on Facebook Africa. Declan, I'm going to come to you. Is there hope for the heat to come down?
So, look, yeah, there's hope, but I think the aftermath of this assassination attempt just highlighted the problems more than the solutions, right? I've mentioned it before, but it's abundantly clear in the U.S. and I think globally that the social and economic dividends from the present international system, which the U.S. is both part of and very much leading, it's not, those dividends are not being felt by people, right? They're not being felt by people in the United States. They're not being felt by people in Kenya, in Nigeria, or most places. The people who are benefiting are increasingly small and limited. And this is at a true kind of global and macro level. This is what is driving the animosity. People feel left out, right? You've got the Rust Belt who feels left out. You've got the Black and African American community who feels left out. You've got the Hispanic community who feels left out, and it's a tremendous problem. And it's going to take systems, it's going to take time, and it's going to take leadership to ultimately fix that. And right now, we have people who want to win elections. And we have people who are speaking, who are polarizing, and everybody is just doubting one another. And speaking personally, I'm part of that problem, right? I am clearly on one side of the political issue, and when I hear things, I've made up my mind. Right? Collectively, we're failing one another.
All right. Thank you for your thoughts, Declan. Michaela, I'll give you the final words on this conversation.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with my colleague on his final thoughts, and I think that the unfortunate thing is that people are, rather than solving, I think, some of the issues that we have in this country, legitimate grievances that people have. Unfortunately, we have many people, whether they be certain politicians or whether they be people in the political fray that are ideologues who are willing to capitalize on those grievances, but not actually do something to solve them. And we actually do have, for many of the issues, whether it ranges from things with the U.S. border to economic issues, there are actually legitimate ways to solve some of these issues. But unfortunately, I think, as Declan said, we have people who would rather just be in power instead. So I think that would be one of the ways in which to bring down the temperature in the country, not just rhetoric, but also with action that would address some of these issues legitimately.
I appreciate your final thoughts. Michaela Millender is a research analyst with the Soufan Center based in New York, and Declan Galvin is managing director for Exigent Risk Advisory, a strategic consulting firm in Nairobi, Kenya. To the both of you, I appreciate you taking the time. Until we meet again, have a good one.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye now.